you spend enough nights out on the blacktop, you learn a few things. You learn the particular hiss a tire makes right before it blows. You learn to tell the difference between the flicker of a distant town and the heat lightning that plays dead on the horizon. And you learn that for every mile of road, there's a story somebody left behind on it. Most of them are just stories, tall tales cooked up over burnt coffee and regret at a 3 a.m. truck stop. But some of them have teeth.
I heard this one for the first time at a grimy little fuel depot outside of Flagstaff. The kind of place where the air smells like diesel and desperation. I was sitting across from a fella named Earl. At least that's what was stitched on his grease-stained shirt. Earl looked like he'd been spit out by the road itself. Face like a worn-out map. Eyes that had seen too many white lines disappear under his hood. He was talking about a stretch of road, a particular cut through the canyons in western Colorado, a lonely piece of highway that sneaks its way through these ancient tower and rock formations. "You ever run that pass on a full moon?" he asked me, his voice low and full of gravel.
I shrugged, nursing my coffee. "Can't say I pay much mind to the moon, Earl. Just the schedule." He let out a dry little chuckle, a sound like stones scraping together. "You should. The moon matters out there. Matters a whole damn lot." And then he told me the story. He called it the Theater of Shadows. He said that if you drive through those canyons when the moon is high and bright, it lights up the flat faces of the cliffs like giant movie screens. And on those screens, if you're unlucky enough to look, you'll see them. Shadows. Huge, dark figures moving across the stone.
"They ain't your shadow, and they ain't from no passing cars," he said, leaning in closer, his coffee forgotten. "They're old, older than the road, older than the state of Colorado. They're the spirits of the folks who lived there 1,000 years ago. According to Earl, the shadows act out their lives. They hunt beasts with long vanished shapes. They dance in solemn rituals, and they fight terrible, silent wars against one another. A whole history playing out in silhouette, a ghost movie projected by the moon."
"It's a sight to see," he whispered, looking out the dirty window, as if he could see the canyon right there in the parking lot. "Beautiful in a way, terrifying too. But there's a rule, the only rule that matters on that road." He took a long, slow sip on his coffee. He was a storyteller, this old dog. He knew how to hold a pause. "You see it? You keep your foot on the gas," he said, finally. "You glance at it, you appreciate the show, and then you get the hell out of there. You drive until the sun comes up, because whatever you do, you don't stop. You never, ever stop and watch the show till the end."
"What happens if you do?" I asked, playing along. Earl put his mug down with a heavy thud. The smile was gone from his face. All the humor had drained out of him, leaving something cold and hollow behind. "If you watch till the curtains fall," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "your shadow gets up and joins the cast, and it stays there forever." I laughed it off, of course, slapped him on the shoulder and told him he'd been breathing too many diesel fumes. He just shook his head and walked away, leaving his coffee half finished. A trucker never leaves coffee behind. That should have been my first warning.
The story stuck with me, though. It was a good one. For the next few months, I forgot all about it. I had loads to haul, deadlines to meet. Then, one cool October evening, I picked up a load of machine parts in Denver. Destination, Salt Lake City. My dispatcher mapped out my route. It was the fastest way, she said, right through the heart of the mountains. I didn't think anything of it until I was 100 miles out of the city. The sun had bled out behind the peaks, and rising in the east, huge and impossibly white, was a full moon. It was a harvest moon, the kind that looks close enough to touch. And my GPS chimed. In 2 miles, enter Canyon Pass. Suddenly, Earl's gravelly voice was right there in my cab. You ever run that pass on a full moon? It was just a story, I told myself. But as my Peterbilt rumbled down into the gaping mouth of the canyon, the radio began to crackle. Static, nothing but static.
The moonlight was so bright it was like driving in daylight, only the colors were all wrong. The world was silver and black. The road was a pale ribbon, and the cliffs, they were perfect screens, flat, immense, and waiting. I gripped the wheel tighter. Don't be a damn fool, I muttered to myself. It's just rock, it's just moonlight. But I couldn't stop myself from looking. My eyes kept darting from the road to the sheer rock face on my right, watching, waiting, and hoping, with a sudden desperate lurch in my gut, that I wouldn't see a damn thing.
The canyon deepened. The silence was the thickest thing I had ever felt. The rumble of my truck's diesel engine felt like a tiny, insignificant intrusion here. It was like shouting in a cathedral. So when I saw the first flicker of movement on the rock wall to my right, I blinked hard and blamed it on a bat. But it happened again. A flicker, then a long, fluid motion. It wasn't an animal. It was too big. It was a shadow, blacker than the rock it was on, and it stretched a good 50 feet high. My heart hammered against my ribs, against every instinct, against Earl's warning. I slowed the truck. I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, the front of my wreck aimed at a long, flat stretch of the opposing cliff face. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute.
I left the headlights on, but the real show was being lit by the moon. At first, it was just the one figure, tall, slender, carrying what looked like a long spear. Then, another shadow emerged, a four-legged shape with antlers. The hunter stalked the prey, and I was transfixed. I was watching a hunt that had happened 1,000 years ago, played out in perfect silence. The shadow hunter drew back its arm, the spear poised, and then more figures began to bleed out of the rock. To the left, a circle of smaller shadows sitting around a central fire that gave off no light. A ritual. I was mesmerized. Fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by a profound, terrible awe. Earl wasn't crazy. This was real.
Suddenly, the far right of the cliff exploded with motion. Warriors, dozens of them. They poured over a ridge, and a silent, epic battle began. Figures fell, arrows flew, and the whole cliff face became a writhing tapestry of phantom violence. I was watching life, death, worship, and war all at once. 3 separate plays on one colossal stage. I felt incredibly small. I don't know how long I sat there. Time seemed to have stretched and thinned out.
Then I noticed something that made the cold knot of fear in my stomach tighten into a block of ice. Just outside the moonlight spotlight, in the normal dark of the canyon, something was watching me. It wasn't a shadow on the wall. It was a physical darkness, a void in the shape of a man standing by the side of the road on the far side of the canyon. And it was perfectly still, turned toward my truck. It knew I was there. It was a spectator too, or maybe it was the usher. That's what broke the spell. Earl's voice screamed in my mind, "You don't stop and watch the show till the end." I hadn't seen the end. What was the end? I didn't want to find out. My hand fumbled for the ignition key. The engine roared to life, shattering the sacred silence. The headlights seemed to flare, and in their glare, the dark figure across the road was gone. I slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the accelerator. My eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but I couldn't resist one last glance in my side view mirror. The theater was still playing on the cliffs behind me, but one of the shadow warriors, a huge figure with a horned headdress, had stopped fighting. It was turned away from the battle, its head tilted, and it seemed to be looking directly at my retreating truck. It was watching me go. I didn't look back again. I drove until the first gray hint of dawn broke over the mountains, and the long, terrible shadows of the night finally, blessedly, retreated.
You can't outrun a memory. The Theater of Shadows wasn't just a memory. It was a stain. For the next few weeks, my world was different. I started seeing things in the corner of my eye. I was drinking coffee by the gallon just to stay wired, terrified of closing my eyes. When I did sleep, the dreams came. Silent, frantic battles, endlessly repeating hunts. I became obsessed. I needed to know what I had seen. I started with Colorado history. I learned about the Ute, the Anasazi. They lived and died on that land, but there was nothing about a colossal theater of shadows.
What I did find was something else, a pattern of disappearances. Every 5 to 10 years, someone would vanish from that stretch of highway. Their cars would be found, doors unlocked, but the people were gone. No trace. The disappearances often coincided with the week of a full moon. This wasn't just in my head. The canyon took people. I started asking other drivers about it. Most of them thought I was crazy, but every once in a while I'd find an old-timer who had heard the story. A few had even seen the shadows from a distance and sped up. No one admitted to stopping. One night at a truck stop in Nevada, I met a driver named Joseph. He was a Navajo man. I told him my story. He listened patiently. When I finished, he didn't laugh. "Some stories are not for telling," he said, his voice soft. "They are for heeding. You saw the Ananai," he said, "the echoes of a people who are trapped." He said the shadows weren't just replaying their history, they were caught in a loop, a curse that had stained the very rock of the canyon. "They are lonely," Joseph said, "and their loneliness is a hunger. When someone stops and gives the performance an audience, the spirits feel the warmth of a living soul, and they want it."
"What about my shadow?" I asked. Earl said it would join them. Joseph nodded slowly. "The shadow is part of you. To them, it's a doorway. They can't take your life, not directly, but they can take your echo. They can take your shadow and make it part of their world. In return, you get to carry a piece of their emptiness back into yours." A piece of their emptiness. That's what I've been feeling. That hollowed-out feeling, the constant chill that no amount of coffee could warm. "What happens at the end of the show?" I pressed him. Joseph looked down into his tea. "The show ends when the last memory plays out, the memory of their last day. It is in that final moment that the boundary between their world and ours is thinnest. That is when they can reach out. You were wise to run. To see the end is to accept the invitation." His words should have been a final warning, but they had the opposite effect. The feeling of being haunted, I couldn't live with it. I had to end it. And the only way I could think of to end it was to go back, to face it. If I could see the final act, maybe I could finally convince myself it was over, and the curtain could fall in my own mind, too. I started checking the lunar cycle. The next full moon was 3 weeks away. I called my dispatcher. "Sarah," I said, "I need to request a route. I want that Denver to Salt Lake run." The trap was set. I was going back to the Theater of Shadows, and this time I was determined to stay for the final act. The 3 weeks leading up to that drive were the longest of my life. The night I drove out of Denver, the full moon was already high. This time there was no fear, just a grim, heavy resignation. As I entered the canyon, the familiar silence descended. I pulled over at the exact same spot. I killed the engine and the headlights. The show began. The same performance. The hunter, the ritual, the war. But this time, I was looking for the story, and I started to see it. The scenes weren't random. They were a progression. The hunt was for a feast. The ritual was a blessing for the war to come. The war itself wasn't between two equal tribes. The defenders were smaller, fighting with a desperate, doomed bravery. I was watching the story of a tribe's last days.
Hours passed. The battle on the rocks reached a frantic, bloody crescendo. The shadow defenders fell one by one until only a few remained. And then the end came. All the other scenes faded away. Only the end of the battle remained. The last of the tribe's warriors was cut down. The victorious invaders raised their clubs in triumph. The performance, I thought, was over. It was a story of defeat. But it wasn't.
One final shadow emerged. It was a woman, a figure of impossible grace and sorrow. She walked among the bodies of her fallen people. The invaders paid her no mind. The woman knelt beside the body of the final warrior, and she began to wail. There was no sound, but I heard it. I felt it in my bones. A scream of pure, undiluted grief that echoed across 1,000 years. As she wailed, her shadow stretched, twisted, a formless pillar of pure agony. This was the end of the show. This was the curse. It wasn't the battle. It was the sorrow that came after. A sorrow so profound, it had broken time and reality.
My eyes were filled with tears. I had my answer. I understood. And in that moment of understanding, of connection, I felt the invitation. It started at my feet. My shadow, which had been lying still, began to stir. I watched, frozen, as it slowly detached itself from my boots. It pooled on the asphalt and began to rise into a vague, man-like shape. It turned its featureless head toward me for a second, a silent nod of farewell. Then it turned and drifted across the highway. It moved toward the cliff face, drawn by the woman's silent scream. It was going to join her, to become another actor in the eternal play. I had watched until the end, and the price was being paid. I didn't try to stop it. All I could do was sit and watch my own darkness leave me behind.
As my shadow reached the base of the cliff, the last echo of the woman's grief faded. The cliff face went blank. The show was over. I was alone. Completely and utterly alone. I started the truck, I put it in gear and pulled back onto the highway. There was no panic, no terror. There was only a profound, vast, and chilling emptiness. I drove until dawn and pulled into a rest stop. The morning sun was bright, casting long, sharp shadows across the asphalt. The truck cast a huge one. The guardrail cast one. I did not. I stood there in the full, glorious light of the morning sun, and there was nothing behind me. I held my hand up, and the sunlight passed right through it. It was like I was made of glass. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. I stumbled back against my truck, my heart a cold dead weight in my chest.
It's been a year since that night. Life is different now. I still drive, but I'm a ghost in my own life. There's a coldness in me that never goes away. Food tastes like ash. Music sounds distant. People sense it. Waitresses avoid my table. Other drivers at the truck stops will stop talking when I sit down. They can't see what's missing, but they feel the void where my shadow used to be. I'm untethered. A person's shadow anchors them to the world. It proves you're solid. I don't have that proof anymore. I'm just a man taking up space. An echo.
But I'm telling you this for a reason, not for sympathy. There's no help for what I am now. I'm telling you this as a warning. So listen to me. If you're ever driving out in the canyons of Colorado, and the moon is fat and white in the sky, and you see something moving on the cliffs, you do what old Earl told me to do. You give a little nod, you say, "Nice show," and you put the hammer down. You drive like hell is licking at your heels. You admire the performance, but you do not, under any circumstances, stop for a better view. Because there's a new shadow in that theater now. It's not a hunter or a warrior. It's a lanky, lonely figure standing off to the side. Sometimes it looks like a man leaning against the ghost of a truck. And it watches the show, over and over. It's found its place. It's my place. And I'm just what it left behind. The empty body, still driving the roads, forever looking for the part of me I left behind on that stage of stone.